Imagine this. It is the 1st of September of 1939. The sky over Europe is still dark, barely hinting at a grey stripe on the horizon. In a small radio station in the border town of Gliwice, the silence of the night is broken. A group of individuals dressed in Polish uniforms bursts into the facilities, grabs the microphone, and broadcasts a brief message in Polish. It would seem like an attack, a provocation, a covert declaration of war, but there is something the world does not yet know. Those figures are not Polish soldiers. They are SS agents in disguise, executing a secret operation. On the floor lies the lifeless body of Franciszek Honiok, a Catholic farmer from Silesia, sympathetic to the Polish cause, arrested by the Gestapo, drugged, and murdered so that his corpse would serve as evidence of an aggression that never existed. It is a lie from beginning to end. But the propagandistic machinery of Joseph Goebbels is already in motion, fabricating headlines about a supposed atrocious attack against Germany. Why did Hitler need to invent a fake attack to justify the invasion of an entire country? What kind of mind designs a fabricated crime scene, with corpses dressed in props and pre-recorded radio messages, only to give the appearance of being the victim? And above all, how is it possible that millions of Germans believed, during the following 2 years, that their country was winning a just war, a war provoked by others, a war that supposedly Germany did not want but was forced to fight? That is the question that is going to guide everything we will see today. It is not just about battles and dates. It is about understanding how a regime constructed a narrative so powerful that it convinced an entire nation that victory was assured, that every step taken was correct, that defeat was impossible. We are going to go through 3 decisive moments: the invasion of Poland, the fall of France, and Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion on record. And in each of those moments, we are going to look not only at what happened on the battlefields, but at what the Germans were told was happening, the official version, the manipulated version, the version that fueled a blind trust in a leader who would lead his own country to the abyss. Before you settle in, take a moment to give the video a good like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you are listening to us from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who joins us from all parts of the world. Well, let's go back to the moment when it all started. To understand the invasion of Poland, we need to go back a few months, when Europe was plunged into a deceptive calm, that calm that precedes the most devastating disasters. Since 1933, Adolf Hitler had been systematically challenging the order established after the First World War. Every move he made seemed an act of calculated audacity, and every time the world expected a firm response, it did not find one. In 1936, he remilitarized the Rhineland, a region that the Treaty of Versailles had declared demilitarized. The German generals trembled, convinced that France would respond with force. But France did nothing. Great Britain did nothing. And Hitler learned a lesson that would define the following years. Audacity, when it meets no resistance, becomes doctrine. 2 years later, in 1938, he annexed Austria in what became known as the Anschluss. German troops crossed the Austrian border without firing a single shot. The population, manipulated by years of propaganda, received the soldiers with flowers and applause. Europe looked the other way. Then came the Sudetenland crisis, that strip of Czechoslovakia inhabited by a German-speaking majority. Hitler demanded its incorporation into the Reich, and at the Munich Conference of September 1938, Great Britain and France agreed, believing that with that concession a greater war would be avoided. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned to London waving a piece of paper, proclaiming that he had achieved peace for our time. But in March of 1939, Hitler violated that agreement by invading and annexing what remained of Czechoslovakia. There were no ethnic Germans to protect there. There was no Versailles clause to invoke. It was pure, naked conquest, without ethnic or diplomatic pretext. And that was the turning point. Great Britain and France finally understood that concessions did not work, that the policy of appeasement had failed resoundingly, that Hitler did not stop at promises. So, on the 31st of March of 1939, both nations offered Poland a formal guarantee of its territorial integrity. If Germany attacked Poland, Great Britain and France would enter into war. But did that stop Hitler? No, not for a moment. Because in the mind of Adolf Hitler, Poland was not simply a territorial issue. It was not just about the Polish corridor, that strip of land that separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany, and that had been granted to Poland after the Treaty of Versailles. It was not just about the free city of Danzig, with its German-speaking majority. For Hitler, Poland represented something much deeper, much more ideological. It was the first step towards the East. It was the gateway to Lebensraum, the living space, that according to Nazi doctrine, Germany needed to fulfill its destiny as a supposed master race. On the 23rd of May of 1939, Hitler explained to his officers with absolute clarity that the objective of the aggression against Poland was not Danzig. It was the need to obtain German living space. The details of this concept would be formulated later in the infamous Generalplan Ost, a plan for colonization, displacement, and extermination on a continental scale. But to invade Poland without risking a two-front war, Hitler needed to neutralize the Soviet Union, and this is where the story takes one of its most chilling turns. On the 23rd of August of 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, two ideologically opposed regimes, two sworn enemies, signed a non-aggression pact that shook the entire world. It is known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, after the names of the foreign ministers who signed it: Vyacheslav Molotov for the Soviet Union and Joachim von Ribbentrop for Germany. The pact contained a secret clause that divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland would be split in two, the western half for Germany, the eastern half for the Soviet Union. Why did Stalin accept such an agreement with the regime he despised the most? Because negotiations with Great Britain and France to form a defensive alliance had failed. The Western allies had not been able or had not wanted to offer sufficient guarantees. And Stalin, ever pragmatic, ever calculating, decided to buy time by signing peace with the devil. Hitler, for his part, always considered that pact as a temporary maneuver, a tactical tool. Since the 1920s, the destruction of the Soviet Union had been one of the fundamental pillars of his ideology. But first, he needed to secure his eastern flank in order to act in the West, first Poland, then the world. And here appears a detail that is particularly disturbing. Hitler not only wanted the invasion to take place, he wanted it to seem justified. He wanted Germany to appear as the victim, not as the aggressor. So he ordered Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, to execute what became known as Operation Himmler, a series of false flag operations designed to fabricate pretexts. The most infamous of all was the Gleiwitz incident, that scene with which we open this narrative. But it was not the only one. There was an attack on the German customs post in Hochlinden, where SS agents dressed in Polish uniforms fired on other Germans disguised as border guards. There was an aggression at the Pichim forestry station, where the SS murdered several concentration camp prisoners who had been brought there and dressed in uniforms of the Polish army. In each case, the attackers left behind corpses in Polish uniforms to sell the farce. The Germans referred to these bodies with the code name Konserve, which means conserves or canned goods. Beings who were once living people, reduced to a word that designates packaged products. That dehumanization was not an accident, it was the system. And did the world believe it? The international community? No. Great Britain and France were not fooled by the claims of Polish aggression, but the German public, bombarded by state-controlled media, largely accepted the narrative of Polish hostility. The propaganda created a climate of fear and patriotic fervour that made the invasion seem defensive rather than aggressive. On the 31st of August of 1939, Hitler sent a last-minute ultimatum to Poland that included 16 demands. He then delivered a speech announcing that Poland had rejected those demands, even though the ultimatum had not even been presented to Poland before the invasion began. It was theatre. It was manipulation on an industrial scale, and it worked, at least within the borders of Germany. Now, let us stop for a moment and ask the question that few ask. What did it feel like to be a common German citizen that morning of the 1st of September of 1939? Not a fanatic Nazi, not an SS officer, an ordinary citizen, a mother in Berlin, a merchant in Munich, a young student in Hamburg. What did they hear on the radio? The voice of Hitler, resonating through the loudspeakers, declaring that Germany had been attacked by Poland and that since 5:45 in the morning, we have been returning fire. It was a lie, but they did not know it, or they did not want to know it, or they could not know it, because every source of alternative information had been systematically eliminated. The independent press crushed, the radio stations controlled, foreign newspapers censored. What the German population received that morning was a completely fabricated reality, a narrative in which Germany was the aggrieved nation, forced to defend itself against a bellicose and dangerous Poland. And at that moment, with that lie as a foundation, the war began. At 4:45 in the morning, on the 1st of September of 1939, the old battleship Schleswig-Holstein, which had arrived at the port of the free city of Danzig 6 days earlier, under the excuse of celebrating the anniversary of a German victory in the First World War, opened fire on the Polish garrison at Westerplatte. The sailors had been stationed below deck for days, more than 200 of them awaiting the order. Officially, the ship was there on a ceremonial visit. Colourful flags waved on the masts. The crew wore white dress uniforms. The brass buttons shined under the late summer sun. But the real mission was another. And when the cannons of the Schleswig-Holstein roared in the gloom of the dawn, there was no doubt left. Simultaneously, at almost the exact same instant, Stuka bombers of the Luftwaffe attacked Polish positions near the Tutchow Bridge, trying to prevent Polish sappers from blowing up the bridge before German forces could cross it. And at another point on the border, German planes unloaded bombs on the civilian population of Wielun, a small city that had no significant military defences, destroying around 75% of the town and killing nearly 1,200 people, mostly civilians. It was the first German war crime of the Second World War, and it happened before most of the world even knew that the war had begun. But that is not what the German radio broadcast. What the German people heard was a narrative of legitimate defence, of counterattack, of protection of ethnic German minorities supposedly persecuted in Poland, and that narrative, repeated incessantly, became the accepted truth within the borders of the Reich. The force that Germany deployed against Poland was overwhelming, more than 2,000 tanks, backed by nearly 900 bombers and more than 400 fighter planes, 60 divisions, approximately 1,500,000 soldiers. The operational plan was known as Fall Weiss, Case White. It proposed two simultaneous offensives. From the north, from Pomerania and East Prussia, a force would advance to secure the Polish corridor before turning southeast. From the south, another force would attack between Lodz and Krakow, with the intention of converging with the northern offensive near Warsaw. The strategy depended on a rapid victory to preempt any response from the Western Allies, since 2/3 of the German forces were assigned to the Polish campaign, leaving Germany's western border lightly defended. And what did Poland have to defend itself? An army that, although it had nearly 1 million troops, was severely poorly equipped. It possessed just over 300 planes, most of which the Luftwaffe destroyed in the first days of the invasion. Polish armoured and motorised units were scarce. Polish commanders, following outdated military thinking, tried to confront the Germans head-on, instead of falling back to more natural defensive positions. Polish mobilisation was late, and political considerations forced its army into a disadvantageous deployment. But here is something that is often omitted. The Poles fought with extraordinary fierceness. Despite the disparity in weaponry, in technology, in preparation, the Polish forces inflicted serious casualties on the Germans. It was not a passive surrender. It was a tenacious defense against a military machine that surpassed its defenders in everything. However, the Polish resistance could not alter the numerical and technological reality. The difference was too great. The world adopted a new term to describe the military tactic that Germany deployed with such success: Blitzkrieg, lightning war. The concept consisted of launching a surprise attack with massive and concentrated forces of fast-moving armoured units. Backed by overwhelming air power, speed was the primary weapon, not giving the enemy time to reorganise, to counter-attack, to even breathe, striking with such force and such speed that resistance crumbles before it can articulate itself. The German units advanced with a celerity that surprised even the generals of the Reich themselves. The troops reached the outskirts of Warsaw between the 8th and the 9th of September, barely a week after the start of the invasion. 1 week. In 7 days, the most powerful army in Europe had crossed the border defences of an entire country and was at the gates of its capital. And what did the German propaganda say about this? It presented it as irrefutable proof of the superiority of the Wehrmacht, of the invincibility of the German soldier, of the strategic genius of Adolf Hitler. The newsreels of the Reich showed endless columns of tanks advancing along dusty roads, planes crossing clear skies, smiling soldiers raising the swastika flag over conquered buildings. The images were real, but the context was completely distorted. They did not show the bombings on defenseless civilian populations. They did not show the summary executions of intellectuals, political leaders, and members of the Polish elite at the hands of the Einsatzgruppen, the death squads of the SS. Because that was what nobody told the German people. This war was not just about conquest, it was about annihilation. On the 22nd of August, just days before the invasion, Hitler had delivered a speech before his military commanders in Obersalzberg. In that speech, he declared that the objective of the war was to physically destroy the enemy. Persons of Polish origin were to be eliminated without pity. The campaign was to be carried out with the greatest brutality and without mercy. To that end, the Einsatzgruppen and the police battalions were formed to exterminate those Poles who might oppose German rule. Lists of prominent people were drawn up who had to be tracked down and murdered as soon as possible. In the last 3 months of 1939, the Nazis murdered 65,000 Poles, Jewish and non-Jewish. 65,000 people in 3 months. Near Bydgoszcz, a site that would become known as the Valley of Death, the Einsatzgruppen executed approximately 800 people, intellectuals, political leaders, members of the Polish elite. It was a systematic extermination of any voice that could organise resistance. And in Germany? In Germany, a quick and clean victory was being celebrated. The radio played triumphal marches. Newspapers published maps with the arrows of the advance. Cinema newsreels showed soldiers feeding Polish children as if they were liberators. The dissonance between reality and the official narrative was abysmal, but inside the informational bubble of the Reich, that dissonance did not exist. Only the approved version existed. On the 17th of September, when it seemed that the Polish resistance could still be prolonged, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east, complying with the secret clause of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. For Poland, it was the final blow. Attacked simultaneously by 2 powers, from 2 opposite flanks, its fate was sealed. On the 27th of September of 1939, barely 26 days after the start of the invasion, Warsaw surrendered. On the 6th of October, the last operational Polish units laid down their arms. Poland was divided. The western part was annexed to the Greater German Reich. The eastern part was absorbed by the Soviet Union. An entire nation wiped off the map in little more than a month. And the leader who ordered it, Adolf Hitler, saw his own narrative confirmed. Germany was invincible. The Blitzkrieg was infallible. The largest army on the continent could not be stopped. But was it really as simple as the propaganda presented it? Was it a perfect operation, without flaws, without risks? The truth is no, and that is one of the aspects that the Nazi narrative jealously hid. Before the invasion began, Hitler's general staff was worried. They considered the assault to be premature. The Wehrmacht was not yet at full capacity. Victory could not be taken for granted. The invasion was, in reality, a highly calculated risk, one that Hitler was so willing to assume that he had originally scheduled it for a week earlier. It was postponed at the last moment, partly because Hitler was considerably shaken, in the words of General Franz Halder, by the reaffirmation of the Anglo-Polish alliance on the 25th of August. And there was an incident that almost gave it all away ahead of time. On the 25th of August, approximately 70 agents of the Abwehr, German military intelligence, under the command of Lieutenant Hans Albrecht Herzner, attacked and tried to capture a key railway station and tunnel in the Jablonkau Pass in Poland. It was the first commando operation of the Second World War, but Herzner did not know that Hitler had postponed the invasion at the last minute. When the order to stop arrived, it was already too late. The agents had acted. It was a coordination error that could have alerted Poland and the Allies to what was about to happen. There was also an act of sabotage on the 28th of August, when a German saboteur named Anton Guzzi placed and detonated 2 time bombs hidden in suitcases at the Tarnow train station in Poland, killing 20 people and wounding 35. These incidents prior to the formal invasion show that the machinery of aggression was in motion long before the 1st of September. The war began in the margins before exploding in the centre. And now let's think about something. On the 3rd of September of 1939, 2 days after the invasion, Great Britain and France declared war on Nazi Germany, fulfilling their guarantee to Poland. Hitler received the news with a mixture of irritation and contempt. He did not expect the Western Allies to actually act. He had calculated that, as in previous crises, they would limit themselves to protesting and then negotiating. But this time was different. Great Britain and France declared war. However, and this is crucial, declaring war did not mean waging war, not immediately. In early September of 1939, the French army launched a limited offensive in the Saar, but by mid-October it had retreated to its initial positions. There was no massive intervention to save Poland. The Western Front became immersed in what the press called the joke war, or phony war, a period of 6 months in which the conflict between France and Germany was limited to a 100-mile stretch of common border between the Rhine River and the border with Luxembourg, with limited pressure on narrow sectors of that area. For Nazi propaganda, this was a gift. The inaction of the Allies was presented as weakness, as cowardice, as proof that Great Britain and France were not willing to risk anything for Poland. And for millions of Germans, the reading was clear. Hitler was right. The world protested but did not act. Germany could expand without real consequences. But was that true? Did the Allied inaction signify permanent incapacity? Or were the Allies simply buying time, waiting for the right moment to respond? That question would be answered in the following months, although the answer would not arrive in the way anyone expected. Meanwhile, inside the Reich, the euphoria over the conquest of Poland mixed with a deeper and more dangerous feeling, the sensation that Germany was destined to win. It was not just military confidence, it was an almost religious conviction, fueled by propaganda, by Hitler's speeches, by the seemingly uninterrupted sequence of successes. Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, 3 conquests in 3 years, without a significant defeat, without a visibly lost battle. The narrative was perfect, hermetically sealed, and within it there was no room for the possibility of failure. And what happened to the Poles? Following the defeat, the German authorities began to implement their racial policies in the occupied territories. Jews were forced to identify themselves wearing white armbands with a blue Star of David. They were drafted for forced labour. Hundreds of thousands of Poles were expelled from their homes, and more than 500,000 ethnic Germans were settled in their place. The occupation of Poland became one of the most brutal episodes of the Second World War, with between 5,470,000 and 5,670,000 Polish deaths over the course of the war, approximately 1/6 of the country's total population, and more than 90% of those deaths belonged to civilians. But none of that appeared in the German newsreels. The version consumed by the people was one of order, of progress, of civilization brought to the east. The gap between reality and perception was an abyss, and that abyss was about to widen even further. Because now Hitler was looking west, and what came next was going to shake the foundations of Europe in a way that nobody, absolutely nobody, had imagined possible. How did Germany manage to defeat France, the most feared military power on the continent, in barely 6 weeks? Was it pure military superiority? Was it strategic genius? Or was it something else? Something that nobody saw coming? Let's find out. Following the conquest of Poland, a strange, dense silence settled over Western Europe, charged with a tension that found no release. The French soldiers sat in their trenches along the Maginot Line, that monumental chain of concrete, steel, and heavy artillery fortifications that France had built along its border with Germany after the First World War. The British sent their expeditionary force to the continent, and for months, nothing happened. The press called it the drôle de guerre in French, the phony war in English, the Sitzkrieg in German. A sitting war, a waiting war, a conflict declared but not executed. German submarines sank Allied merchant ships in the Atlantic, and the Germans sent discreet diplomatic proposals in the hope that a negotiated peace would allow them to consolidate their gains. But by early 1940, both Hitler and their allies contemplated the expansion of the war towards Scandinavia. In April of 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. Denmark fell in a day. Norway resisted more, but was ultimately subdued. The military costs of the Norwegian campaign were relatively light, in proportion to the forces deployed. However, the British lost several destroyers, and the aircraft carrier Glorious was sunk while covering the evacuation convoys from Narvik. The political consequences, however, were immediate and profound. The government of British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, whose war efforts had been criticised as always too late or too little, was subjected to a vote of confidence on the 8th of May of 1940. Although Chamberlain survived that motion, dozens of members of his own party voted against him. His government was on the verge of collapse. And here, history writes one of those dramatic twists that seem like fiction. While Chamberlain made a desperate last attempt to save his administration, on the other side of the English Channel, Germany was preparing another offensive. Hitler was emboldened by the mediocre Allied performance in Norway. If that was the best response Great Britain and France could offer, then the path to the west was clear. The generals of the Reich, however, were not so sure. Many doubted. Many feared. The German army of 1940 was not the uniformly modern force that the propaganda presented. Only half of the available divisions were in full operational condition, and many were worse equipped than the German army of 1914, or than their equivalents in the British and French armies. The majority of German logistical transport depended on horse-drawn vehicles. The army was, in the words of historians, semi-modern. A small number of well-equipped and elite divisions compensated by many second- and third-rate divisions. But did the German public know that? Of course not. What the public knew was that their army had devastated Poland in a month, and now that same force was heading west. The original plan for the invasion of France and the Low Countries was called Fall Gelb, Case Yellow. Initially, it was a fairly conventional plan, an advance through Belgium, similar to the Schlieffen Plan of the First World War, but an incident changed everything. On the 10th of January of 1940, a German plane carrying a general staff officer with the Luftwaffe's plans for the offensive through central Belgium had to make an emergency landing near Maasmechelen in Belgium. The documents were captured. Although Allied intelligence doubted they were genuine, the Germans assumed their plan had been compromised. What do you think of the content? Do you like this type of video? Then comment the phrase, "I want more stories." That way you will encourage us to bring more historical topics, and you will also help the participation of the video, okay? Also, do not forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave your like so that YouTube keeps recommending our videos to you. It was then that a relatively unknown general, Erich von Manstein, proposed a radical alternative that would change the history of the war. Instead of advancing through Belgium, as the Allies expected, the main effort should pass through the Ardennes, that forested and mountainous massif that the French considered impassable for an armoured force. The French had staked their entire defensive strategy on two assumptions: that the attack would come through Belgium and that the Ardennes were an impenetrable natural barrier for the tanks. They were wrong on both. Hitler, who had already shown an inclination for bold solutions, adopted Manstein's plan. Army Group A, under the command of Gerd von Rundstedt, with 45.5 divisions, including 7 panzer divisions, would execute the main effort through the Ardennes. At the same time, Army Group B would launch an attack on Belgium and the Low Countries that would function as a gigantic trap. It would draw the best Allied troops to the north, towards Belgium, while the true mortal blow came from where nobody expected it. The manoeuvre that the Germans executed is sometimes called Sichelschnitt, the German translation of the expression sickle cut, coined by Winston Churchill after the event. It is a perfect image, a sickle that cuts the wheat at the base. The Allies advanced north, into the trap, while the German panzers cut from behind, through the Ardennes, towards the English Channel, splitting the Allied armies into two disconnected halves. On the 10th of May of 1940, the Wehrmacht invaded Belgium, Luxembourg, the Low Countries, and parts of France. The operation began at 2:30 in the morning. German airborne elements landed at key points in Belgium and Holland ahead of the ground forces, capturing bridges and strategic routes. In Belgium, a group of German paratroopers took the fort of Eben-Emael, one of the most modern fortifications in Europe, with its garrison of 2,000 troops, losing barely 6 paratroopers. 6 against 2,000. Other paratroopers landed in Rotterdam and The Hague under complete surprise. And exactly as the Germans had planned, the Allies took the bait. The best French troops and the British Expeditionary Force advanced into Belgium to meet what they believed was the main German attack. And while they did so, while they moved their forces north, the German panzer divisions were crossing the Ardennes. And the French reaction? It was one of disbelief. When the first reports arrived, indicating that German armoured columns were emerging from the Ardennes, many French officers refused to believe it. It was impossible according to their doctrine. Tanks could not pass through there. The terrain was too rugged, the roads too narrow, the forest too dense. But the German panzers had not read the French manuals. On the 14th of May, the 15th and 19th Panzer Corps broke the Allied defences at Sedan, allowing the German forces to completely bypass the formidable defences of the Maginot Line. It was one of those moments when history turns on its axis. The Maginot Line, that chain of fortifications in which France had invested billions, became irrelevant. It was not taken. It was simply ignored. The Germans passed where the line did not cover, where the French had said it could not be passed. On the 15th of May, the Panzer Corps crossed into northern France. The same day, after intense bombings over Rotterdam, the Low Countries surrendered to the Germans. On the 17th of May, Antwerp and Brussels fell. The Allied forces were in full retreat, heading towards the French coast. And Hitler? What did Hitler feel in those moments? According to the testimonies of those around him, he was exultant, almost euphoric. The plan that many of his generals had considered too risky was working perfectly. The war that, according to his own general staff, could have resulted in a failure was becoming the greatest military victory that Europe had witnessed in generations. But now came the most critical part. The Allied forces were being pushed towards the English Channel. More than 400,000 British, French, and Belgian soldiers found themselves trapped in a strip of land that was shrinking more and more around a small port on the northern coast of France, a place that was about to be engraved in the collective memory of the world. Dunkirk. Towards the end of May of 1940, the situation of the Allies was desperate. The German panzer divisions had crossed the Ardennes on the 20th of May, reaching the coast near Abbeville, splitting the Allied forces in two. The British Expeditionary Force and the French First Army found themselves entrapped in northern France. The Allied commanders had sent their best troops to Belgium to confront the Germans, leaving their southern flank exposed. The German tanks were moving faster than anyone had foreseen. And then something happened that, to this day, historians continue to debate. On the 24th of May, Gerd von Rundstedt ordered the German armoured forces to halt less than 24 kilometres from Dunkirk. This decision became one of the most controversial of the entire war. After the conflict, the German generals pointed to Hitler as responsible for the failure to annihilate the trapped Allied forces. In reality, several high-ranking generals shared the responsibility. The reasons were multiple. The panzer divisions were worn out after weeks of uninterrupted advance. The supply lines were extended. The swampy terrain around Dunkirk would have limited the effectiveness of the tanks, and Hermann Göring had promised that the Luftwaffe could finish off the Allies from the air. It has also been speculated that Hitler believed the British would negotiate more easily if he showed them clemency at that moment. If that was his intention, he was completely wrong. Because that pause, that 24-hour halt that was later extended, was the window the Allies needed. On the 26th of May of 1940, at 6:57 in the evening, Operation Dynamo began, the evacuation of the Allied forces from Dunkirk. Admiral Bertram Ramsay directed the operation from a deep room in the cliffs of Dover that had once housed a dynamo, a type of electrical generator, which gave the operation its name. Churchill and his advisors had hoped that it would be possible to rescue only between 20,000 and 30,000 troops. The reality surpassed all expectations. During 9 days, from the 26th of May until the 4th of June, a fleet of more than 800 naval vessels, of all sizes and shapes, crossed the English Channel to transport troops. But the port of Dunkirk had been bombed until it was unusable, and the beaches had such a gentle slope that large warships could not approach. It was then that the British Admiralty made an unprecedented call. They asked the owners of small civilian boats to help, and they responded. Hundreds of pleasure boats, yachts, barges, fishing launches, vessels of all kinds, crewed by civilians who had no military obligation whatsoever, crossed the channel under the fire of Luftwaffe fighters and bombers, under the attack of German artillery, under the threat of submarines, to go back and forth between the beaches and the larger warships waiting in deep waters. They would be known as the little ships of Dunkirk. The Royal Air Force deployed 16 squadrons to protect the evacuation, flying more than 3,500 sorties in support of the operation. The aerial combats over Dunkirk were fierce. The Germans attacked the beaches and the port with 300 bombers, protected by 550 fighter sorties. They dropped 15,000 high-explosive bombs and 30,000 incendiary bombs, destroying the oil tanks and shattering the port. They sank ships. They strafed the beaches. They pursued the vessels to within a few miles of the English coast. And even so, against all odds, more than 338,000 Allied soldiers were evacuated. 338,000, including approximately 198,000 soldiers of the British Expeditionary Force and 140,000 French and Belgian soldiers. It was, without a doubt, the greatest evacuation in military history up to that moment. Churchill, with his characteristic lucidity, warned against triumphalism. Wars are not won with evacuations, but the effect on morale was incalculable. What was called the Dunkirk spirit was created. That collective disposition to unite, to resist, to fight against all odds. And the rescued soldiers, although they had abandoned or destroyed almost all their heavy equipment on the beaches, constituted Great Britain's most valuable resource, its trained and experienced troops. If they had been lost, the course of the war would have been completely different. And how did Hitler see it? Hitler declared that the evacuation was a decisive victory for Germany. The propaganda of the Reich presented Dunkirk as a crushing defeat for the Allies. They showed the abandoned beaches, the thousands of destroyed vehicles, the piles of equipment left behind. Dunkirk has fallen, proclaimed the German headlines. 40,000 French and English have been captured as the last remnant of once great armies. An incalculable booty has been taken. And in a certain sense, it was not entirely false. The British army had fled the continent. It had lost practically all its heavy weaponry. France was about to fall. The appearance was that of a total defeat for the Allies. The narrative of the German victory seemed more solid than ever. But what the propaganda hid was that 338,000 soldiers had escaped. Those soldiers would live to fight another day. They would form the backbone of the defence of Great Britain. Some would participate in the most important operations of the following years. Dunkirk was not the end of the Allied army, it was its survival. And that survival, invisible in the newsreels of the Reich, would be one of the reasons why Germany would eventually lose the war. But that was in the future. In June of 1940, all that was seen was German victory after German victory. On the 5th of June of 1940, the second phase of the Battle of France began. Fulrott, case read. The German forces attacked south from the Somme River with overwhelming numbers. More than 100 German divisions faced only 60 French divisions and 2 British divisions that remained on the continent. The French commanders had to defend a line almost 1,000 kilometres long, but they simply did not have the necessary reserves. The French counterattacks could not stop the German advance. On the 9th of June, the German forces launched an offensive on Paris. On the 10th of June, Norway surrendered to the German forces, and Italy entered the war, declaring war on France and Great Britain, opening a new front in the southeast of France that further stretched the already exhausted French defences. On the 13th of June, Paris was declared an open city by the French government, which fled to Bordeaux. On the 14th of June, German troops entered the French capital, Paris, the City of Light, the cultural capital of Europe, under the boot of the Wehrmacht. The photographs of Hitler posing in front of the Eiffel Tower, with the contained smile of the conqueror, became one of the most iconic and most disturbing images of the 20th century. On the 16th of June, Marshal Henri-Philippe Pétain became Prime Minister of France, replacing Paul Reynaud. The next day, Pétain asked Germany for the terms of the armistice, and here Hitler executed an act of calculated symbolic cruelty. He ordered that the French surrender be signed in the very same train car in which Germany had signed its own humiliating surrender at the end of the First World War, decades ago. The armistice was signed on the 22nd of June of 1940, officially putting an end to the German campaign against France and the Low Countries. In little more than 6 weeks, the German armed forces had invaded Belgium and the Low Countries, expelled the British Expeditionary Force from the continent, captured Paris, and forced the surrender of the French government. 4 countries in 6 weeks. It was the fastest and most devastating conquest that Europe had seen since the Napoleonic Wars. At the end of the Battle of France, Nazi Germany assumed direct control of the northern half of France and created a puppet state in the south called Vichy France. Great Britain was left alone as the last Allied country in Europe facing Germany's aggression. In total, the Allies suffered more than 360,000 casualties in the battle, while the Axis powers suffered 163,000. The disproportion was brutal, and in Germany, the euphoria was absolute, total, without nuances. Hitler was hailed as the greatest military genius since Napoleon, if not greater. The newsreels of the Reich showed images of German soldiers strolling down the Champs-Élysées, visiting the Arc de Triomphe, taking photos in front of Notre Dame. Newspapers proclaimed that the war was practically won. that Great Britain would not take long to sue for peace, that the new European order was consolidated. Confidence inside Germany reached its highest point, and it was at that precise moment, at that pinnacle of certainty, where the seed of the greatest military catastrophe in history was sown. Because Hitler, intoxicated by his own successes, convinced of his own infallibility, made a decision that would change everything. A decision that more than any other would define the destiny of the war, of Europe, and of the entire world. What was that decision? What led Hitler to take the most dangerous step of his military career? And why did almost everyone around him tell him it was going to work? To answer those questions, we need to delve into the most ambitious, bloodiest, and most decisive phase of the entire Second World War, Operation Barbarossa. In July of 1940, just weeks after the conquest of France and the Low Countries, Hitler made the decision to attack the Soviet Union the following year. That decision, adopted at the moment of his maximum triumph, revealed something fundamental about the mind of Adolf Hitler. No victory was sufficient. No conquest satisfied his ambition. Every success, instead of generating caution, fueled the next gamble, larger, riskier, more delirious. Why attack the Soviet Union? Why break the pact that had been so useful to him? Why open a second front when Great Britain had not yet been defeated? The reasons were multiple. Ideological first. Since the 1920s, the destruction of the Soviet Union by military force, the permanent elimination of the perceived communist threat, and the capture of land within Soviet borders as Lebensraum for long-term German settlement had been central policies of the Nazi movement. Hitler had always considered the Non-Aggression Pact of August of 1939 as a temporary tactical maneuver. Strategic second, Hitler believed that the defeat of the Soviet Union would deprive Great Britain of its last potential ally on the continent, forcing it to negotiate. If Russia fell, who would be left to fight against Germany? And personal, third, arrogance. The conviction fueled by the conquest of France that the Wehrmacht was invincible. The invasion plans drawn up by the German military elite were substantially influenced by the hubris derived from the rapid defeat of France at the hands of the invincible Wehrmacht and by traditional German stereotypes about Russia and its armed forces. If France, with one of the most powerful armies in the world, had fallen in 6 weeks, how much could the Soviet Union resist, with an army poorly trained, poorly equipped, and led by officers who feared Stalin more than the enemy? On the 18th of December of 1940, Hitler signed Führer Directive No. 21, in which he outlined the precise manner in which the operation would be carried out. He also gave it its name, Operation Barbarossa, in reference to the medieval emperor Frederick I of the Holy Roman Empire, known as Frederick Barbarossa, Redbeard, a leader of the Third Crusade in the 12th century. The choice of the name was not accidental. It evoked crusade, a holy war, a civilizing mission against the East. Nazi propaganda would present the invasion as exactly that, a crusade against Bolshevism, against barbarism, against communist chaos. The Barbarossa Decree, issued by Hitler on the 30th of March of 1941, complemented the directive by decreeing that the war against the Soviet Union would be a war of annihilation, and legalized the eradication of all communist political leaders and the intellectual elites in Eastern Europe. The German army, the Wehrmacht, viewed the war in the East as a crusade against communism, not subject to the normal rules of war. Soviet prisoners of war would not receive the treatment that international conventions demanded. Political commissars would be executed on the spot. The civilian population would be considered expendable. The invasion was originally scheduled for mid-May of 1941, but the unforeseen need to invade Yugoslavia and Greece in April of that year forced the Germans to postpone the Soviet campaign until late June. The rapidity of Hitler's victories in the Balkans allowed him to meet this revised schedule, but the 5 weeks of delay shortened the time available to carry out the invasion of the Soviet Union, and would turn out to be even more severe because in 1941, the Russian winter would arrive earlier than usual. 5 weeks. That was the margin that separated Germany from its original plan. 5 weeks that, as we will see, would prove fatal. But in June of 1941, nobody within the German High Command saw that as an insurmountable problem. Confidence was absolute. The plan was clear. The force assembled was the largest ever assembled for a military operation in the history of humanity. How large? The figures defy imagination. More than 3,800,000 Axis soldiers invaded the Soviet Union along a front of 2,900 kilometers. 148 divisions, representing 80% of the German army, were committed to the enterprise. 17 panzer divisions, formed into 4 panzer groups, constituted the vanguard with 3,400 tanks. They were supported by 2,700 planes of the Luftwaffe. In addition to the German forces, 650,000 soldiers from Germany's allies, Romania and Finland, joined the effort. Also forming part of the attack were more than 3,000 tanks, almost 3,000 planes, 7,000 artillery pieces, 600,000 vehicles, and more than 600,000 horses. It was the largest invasion force up to that date. Nothing in history compared to it. Not the legions of Rome, not the armies of Napoleon, not the forces of the First World War. Nothing. 3 army groups deployed towards 3 different objectives. Army Group North, under the command of Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, headed towards Leningrad. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, aimed for Moscow. And Army Group South, led by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, advanced towards Kiev and Ukraine. The entire strategy was a reissue of the Blitzkrieg concept that had been so successful in France. The idea was to win without fighting in a prolonged manner, advancing with such speed and such forcefulness that the enemy would crumble before it could react, encircling it, surrounding it, annihilating its capacity for resistance in a matter of weeks, not months. And what did the Soviet Union have to defend itself? In numbers, a lot. The Soviet Air Force possessed approximately 19,533 planes, making it the largest air force in the world in the summer of 1941. The Red Army had 228 divisions in the path of Barbarossa. But the figures, as impressive as they were, hid profound weaknesses. Only about a quarter of the aircraft of the Soviet Air Force could be described as modern. The tank units were rarely well equipped and lacked training and logistical support. Units were sent into combat without prior arrangements for refueling, ammunition, or personnel replacement. Often, after a single engagement, the units were destroyed or rendered inoperative. The Soviet numerical advantage in heavy equipment was completely annulled by the superior training and organization of the Wehrmacht. And there was an even more serious problem: Stalin's purges. In the late 30s, the Soviet dictator had executed or imprisoned thousands of Red Army officers, including many of the most capable and experienced. The remaining officers feared Stalin as much as the enemy. Initiative on the battlefield, something that mid-ranking German officers exercised naturally, was practically non-existent among their Soviet counterparts, where showing personal initiative could be interpreted as insubordination and lead to execution. Stalin, moreover, stubbornly refused to believe the numerous warnings that Germany was about to attack. As late as the night of the 21st of June, a German communist deserter named Alfred Liskow crossed the lines and informed the Soviets that the attack would begin at 4 a.m. Stalin was informed, but apparently considered it to be disinformation. Liskow was still being interrogated when the invasion began. Around 1 a.m. on Sunday, the 22nd of June of 1941, the Soviet military districts in the border zone were alerted via Directive No. 1 from the People's Commissariat for Defense, issued late on the night of the 21st of June. The directive urged them to bring all forces to combat readiness, but to avoid provocative actions of any kind. The message took up to 2 hours to reach several of the units subordinated to the fronts, and the majority did not receive it before the invasion began. And then, in the pre-dawn darkness, the world changed. Operation Barbarossa began at 4:15 in the morning on the 22nd of June of 1941, with bombings by the Luftwaffe against Soviet naval and air bases. By the end of the day, approximately 1,800 Soviet planes had been destroyed on the ground. They had not even taken off. The largest air force in the world was practically annihilated on its own runways in a matter of hours. 6 hours after the start of operations, Germany formally declared war on the Soviet Union. By then, German armoured columns were already deep inside Soviet territory. And at first, everything worked exactly as Hitler had foreseen. The panzers advanced like a storm. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies. The Soviets, taken by surprise, partially demobilized and poorly prepared, suffered catastrophic losses. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured in gigantic battles of encirclement. As part of the southern flank of Box Group, Guderian's tanks travelled 80 kilometres beyond the border on the first day of the invasion and were in Minsk, 320 kilometres further on, by the 27th of June. In Minsk, they converged with Hof's tanks, which had attacked from the northern flank. Although Box infantry could not follow fast enough to complete the encirclement, 300,000 prisoners were captured in the pocket. 300,000 in a single encirclement operation. And that was just the beginning. In the weeks that followed, the encirclements multiplied, Bialystok and Minsk, in the initial weeks, and then the mother of all encirclements, Kiev, in the following months. The Battle of Kiev trapped 4 complete Soviet armies, the 5th, the 37th, the 26th, and the 21st. Nearly 700,000 Soviet prisoners of war were captured in that single operation. 700,000. It is a figure that defies comprehension. By mid-July, the Germans had advanced more than 640 kilometres and were just 320 kilometres from Moscow. They still had enough time to obtain decisive gains before the onset of winter. Germany seemed to be on the verge of another massive victory. And what was being said in Germany? The propaganda of the Reich was at its peak. The newsreels showed images of endless columns of Soviet prisoners, of captured towns, of flags with the swastika waving over Soviet cities. Newspapers published maps showing the unstoppable advance of the German arrows, penetrating deeper and deeper into enemy territory. Hitler's speeches proclaimed that the Soviet Union was collapsing, that the Red Army was destroyed, that total victory was a matter of weeks. And millions of Germans believed it. Why wouldn't they believe it? Every piece of data they received confirmed the narrative. Every piece of news was of victory. Every image was of advance. There was no room for doubt within the informational system of the Reich. The Soviet Union was falling, just as Poland had fallen, just as France had fallen. It was inevitable. It was destiny. But there were signs that the propaganda carefully hid, that something was not going according to plan. The first sign was the Soviet resistance. It was nothing like what the Germans had encountered in Poland or in France. The Soviet troops, even when they were surrounded, even when they were decimated, kept fighting. They did not surrender en masse, as the German planners had expected. Or when they surrendered, others arrived to take their place. The Red Army was like a hydra. For every head cut off, 2 more seemed to sprout. The second sign was the casualties. German casualties were increasing at a rate that nobody had anticipated. In comparison, 30,000 Germans had died during the entire campaign in the West in 1940. In Barbarossa, the figures multiplied exponentially. The Germans suffered more than 750,000 casualties during the operation, with some 200,000 dead. The third sign was logistics. The supply lines stretched further every day. The Soviet roads were worse than expected, the distances greater than calculated, and the infrastructure destroyed by the Soviets themselves in their scorched earth policy, which consisted of destroying anything that might be useful to the invaders before retreating. And the fourth sign, the most ominous of all, was a disagreement within the High Command that would prove devastating. While the Army General Staff, the OKH, proposed Moscow as the primary objective, Hitler wanted the main effort directed southeast, through Ukraine and the Donetsk Basin, towards the Caucasus, with a secondary movement northwest against Leningrad. This debate consumed the entire month of August, and the German forces lost a precious opportunity that would not be repeated. Weeks of good weather, weeks in which they could have advanced towards Moscow while it was still possible, evaporated in strategic discussions. In August of 1941, Hitler ordered the advance on Moscow to halt, so that German forces could concentrate on taking Kiev and other cities in Ukraine. The Germans achieved this, including the massive encirclement of Kiev, but by October they were exhausted and needed fresh supplies. And this is where the history begins to turn. In October, Hitler ordered the German army to resume the push towards Moscow. The operation received the name Operation Typhoon, but the delay had given the Soviets time to strengthen the defense of their capital, with approximately 1 million soldiers and 1,000 new T-34 tanks, one of the best tanks of the war. And the conditions had changed dramatically. The autumn rains had arrived, turning the roads into quagmires. It was the Rasputitsa, the mud season, a phenomenon that transformed Russia's unpaved routes into rivers of mud that could swallow entire vehicles. The German offensive bogged down, literally, in the mud, at the gates of Moscow. By mid-November, the panzer divisions attempted a final effort to surround Moscow, reaching just 20 kilometers from the city. 20 kilometers. They could see the towers of the Kremlin in the distance, but they were exhausted, undersupplied, with vehicles failing due to the cold and mud, and facing increasingly solid Russian defences. And then came the winter. But not just any winter. The Russian winter of 1941 was particularly severe, even by Russian standards. Temperatures dropped below 30 degrees below zero. The German soldiers did not have adequate winter clothing. Nobody had thought they would need it, because nobody had foreseen that the war would last so long. Operation Barbarossa was not designed to drag on into winter. It was assumed that everything would be over by then. But it wasn't. The engine lubricant froze, the weapons jammed, the soldiers suffered frostbite on their extremities. The supplies did not arrive. The supply lines, already stretched to the limit, collapsed under the weight of the cold. Horses died by the thousands, and facing them, the Soviets, accustomed to the climate, reinforced with fresh troops brought from Siberia and the Russian Far East, were waiting. Because now that Japan seemed to be concentrating on the Pacific and no longer represented a threat to the Soviet Union on its eastern border, Stalin was able to transfer fresh and well-equipped divisions from Siberia to the Western Front. These troops were prepared for the cold. They wore winter uniforms. Their weapons worked at low temperatures. And they were commanded by a general who would turn out to be one of the most brilliant strategists of the war, Georgy Zhukov. Moscow remained under threat, but significantly Stalin stayed there. He did not flee. He called upon the entire city to turn into a fortress. And Zhukov organized the defense of the capital with an efficiency that would perplex the German High Command. In early December of 1941, approximately 1 million Soviet soldiers launched a sudden counter-offensive that forced the Germans on the defensive and forced them to retreat. The German forces, which just weeks before had been at the gates of Moscow, now found themselves falling back, fighting not only against the Red Army, but against the climate itself, against the lack of supplies, against the reality of a war that did not follow the script they had written. By the end of the first week of December, the Germans had been pushed towards the outskirts of Soviet territory. The Red Army had suffered appalling losses, 4 million casualties, 3 million of whom languished in German prisoner of war camps in inhumane conditions. But the Soviet Union had not collapsed. Despite catastrophic losses, its will to resist remained unshakable. Operation Barbarossa, the largest military offensive in history, had failed in its primary objective, to force the Soviet Union to surrender. What was supposed to be a campaign of weeks had become a hell that would last years. What was supposed to repeat the success of France became the greatest strategic defeat for Germany. And what were the Germans told? They were told that everything was proceeding according to plan, that the setbacks were temporary, that the winter was the enemy, not the mistaken strategy, nor the underestimation of the opponent. They were told that in the spring the offensives would resume and that the victory would be final. They were told that the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse, that one last push would be enough. And many believed it. Because the alternative, accepting that the leader in whom they had placed their trust, their future, and their lives was wrong, was too terrifying to contemplate. But reality was relentless. In 1942, Hitler launched another major strategic offensive, this time towards the Caucasus Mountains and the oil fields of Baku. Morale was still generally high, and German forces maintained the capacity to inflict enormous losses on poorly managed Soviet formations. In fact, 1942 would be an even worse year than 1941 for the Russians. But the factors that caused the failure of Barbarossa would conspire to doom this new enterprise as well. As the German columns advanced across the seemingly infinite expanses of the steppe towards their distant objectives, including a city called Stalingrad, the victory in the east that had once seemed so certain drifted further and further from sight. Stalingrad. But that is a story for another time. What we need to understand now is something much deeper than battles and strategies. We need to understand the structure of the illusion. From 1939 until late 1941, Nazi Germany lived inside a carefully constructed narrative, a narrative in which every war was defensive, every conquest was just, every victory was inevitable, and every setback was temporary. The propaganda of Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, was a precision machine that converted complex realities into simple tales. Good Germany, bad enemies, invincible Wehrmacht, weak adversaries, certain victory, impossible defeat. But how was that narrative sustained when reality began to contradict it? How can it be explained that millions of intelligent, educated people, capable of critical thinking, accepted a version of events that drifted further and further away from the truth? The answer lies in the structure of the information system. When every source of alternative information is eliminated, when independent journalists are persecuted, when the radio, the press, the cinema, education are controlled, when the act of listening to foreign broadcasts is punished with prison or death, when the only available version of reality is the version approved by the state, people's capacity to critically evaluate information atrophies, not because they are stupid, but because they do not have the data necessary to form an independent judgment. Disinformation does not work by fooling fools. It works by depriving the intelligent of access to the truth. That was what happened in Germany between 1939 and 1941. The population lived a filtered war, edited, processed by Goebbels' machinery, before reaching the eyes and ears of each citizen. Successes were amplified to the epic. Failures were minimized or hidden. Atrocities were denied. Victims were dehumanized. And the illusion of victory remained intact, like a theatre set seen from the seats, perfect and convincing as long as you do not look behind it. But reality, as always, ended up imposing itself. Not all at once, not with a dramatic revelation, but slowly, like water seeping through the cracks of a wall. The soldiers returning from the Eastern Front told stories different from those appearing in the newspapers. The censored letters let slip a darker reality. The trains of wounded arriving at German stations were difficult to reconcile with the narrative of permanent victory. And the absence of those who did not return was a silence that screamed louder than any newsreel. The war that Hitler saw and the war that millions of people lived were two radically different realities. Hitler saw, or wanted to see, an expanding empire, an invincible machine, a manifest destiny being fulfilled step by step. What existed was something very different, a war of aggression based on lies, a series of increasingly unsustainable victories, an army crashing against the limits of geography, climate, and the will to resist of peoples who refuse to be subdued. And the question that remains echoing is this: how long can a nation live inside an illusion? How many false victories? How many cosmetically altered war reports? How many unfulfilled promises are needed before reality breaks through? The answer, in the case of Germany, would be given by time, and it would give it in the most devastating way possible. Now let's step back a moment and observe something that gets lost in the maelstrom of major military operations. The people, the individuals, the nameless faces who live these events not as chapters of a history book, but as days and nights of uncertainty, separation, and suffering. Let's think of a 21-year-old German soldier from some town in Bavaria who wrote letters to his mother from somewhere on the Eastern Front in the autumn of 1941. He was not a Nazi. He was not an ideologue. He was a drafted young man marching east with the conviction, instilled by propaganda, that the war would end soon, that he would return home before Christmas, that the Soviet Union was about to collapse. His letters, if they could be read today, would probably show an emotional arc ranging from initial confidence to growing unease. The dust of the summer roads replaced by the mud of autumn, the autumn mud replaced by the ice of winter, the triumphal marches replaced by daily survival, and the hope, that the radio fed every morning with victory reports, thinning like a candle consumed in the dark. Let's think of a 35-year-old Polish woman in Warsaw in September of 1939, who watched bombers destroy her neighborhood, who watched German soldiers enter her city, whose life fractured into a before and an after that no armistice could repair. For her, the narrative of the German just war was an obscenity, but her voice was not heard in Berlin. In Berlin, only the approved version was heard. Let's think of a 40-year-old Soviet officer who received the directive to avoid provocations barely hours before German bombers devastated his airbase, who watched the planes under his command get destroyed on the ground without taking off, who had to organize a defense with disoriented men, without communications, without clear orders, knowing that any mistake would be punished not by the enemy but by his own government. These people, these millions of people, were the pieces of the board on which Hitler believed he was playing a masterful game. But they were not pieces, they were lives, and the distance between the triumphalist narrative of the Reich and the lived experience of each of those people was the exact measure of the lie. And do you know what is the most disturbing thing of all? That the illusion worked. For a time, it worked extraordinarily well. The German population supported the war with enthusiasm in 1939, with fervour in 1940, and with determination in 1941. The soldiers marched to the front, convinced they were fighting for a just cause. The factories produced weaponry with increasing efficiency. The war economy mobilised with a discipline that other countries envied. All that sustained on a foundation of lies. And when the foundation began to crack, when reality began to seep through the cracks of the propagandistic edifice, there was no alternative structure upon which to build a different understanding. There was no free press, there was no public debate, there was no political opposition. There was only the regime's version, increasingly disconnected from reality, but increasingly insistent, increasingly strident, like a musician playing louder to drown out the noises of a hall that is collapsing. The invasion of Poland was presented as a legitimate defence. The conquest of France was presented as historical justice. Operation Barbarossa was presented as a crusade against Bolshevism. And each of those narratives, each of those layers of the illusion, was necessary to sustain the next. Because if Poland was not legitimate defence, then it was aggression. If France was not historical justice, then it was conquest. If Barbarossa was not a crusade, then it was the greatest genocidal gamble ever undertaken. And if all that was true, then the leader they followed was not a visionary but a criminal. And that conclusion, for millions of people who had invested their faith, their loyalty, and the lives of their loved ones in that leader, was psychologically unbearable. So the illusion was maintained, not out of genuine conviction, not always, but often out of the impossibility of facing the alternative. It is easier to believe that you are winning than to admit that you have followed the wrong person towards the precipice. And that is perhaps the most unsettling lesson of everything we have seen today. It is not a lesson about tanks and strategies. It is a lesson about the fragility of truth in the hands of those who control information, about how an entire society can be led to believe what it needs to believe instead of what is real, about the price, immense, catastrophic, irreversible, that is paid when that illusion finally crumbles. Because it crumbled, not that day, not that year, but it crumbled. And when it did, it dragged an entire continent down with it. Now, let's return to the specific events and delve into the details that are often lost in general accounts. There is an aspect of the invasion of Poland that is rarely mentioned, and that perfectly illustrates the mentality of the Nazi regime in those early days of the war. On the 25th of August of 1939, 6 days before the official invasion, the old battleship Schleswig-Holstein arrived at the port of the free city of Danzig. Officially, it was there to commemorate the anniversary of the German victory in the Battle of Tannenberg during the First World War. The masts were decorated with colourful flags. The crew wore white dress uniforms. The brass buttons gleamed under the late summer sun. It was a ceremonial visit, a gesture of goodwill, a peaceful celebration. But below deck, hidden from everyone's view, more than 200 Marines were waiting. They were waiting for the order to attack the Polish garrison at Westerplatte, a small military transit depot across the harbour. The cover was meticulous. The deception was complete. Polish observers saw a warship on a diplomatic visit. What they did not see was an assault force preparing for the first shot of the most devastating war in history. This level of premeditation, of calculated deceit, of instrumentalization of diplomatic forms to disguise an aggression, was the hallmark of the Nazi regime, and it was not an isolated case, it was the pattern. Every expansionist move by Hitler followed the same logic: create an appearance of legitimacy, fabricate a pretext, and then act with absolute brutality. Let's stop now at the Battle of France to explore a detail that completely changes the habitual perception of that conflict. It is common to hear that France fell because its army was weak, because its soldiers did not want to fight, because French society was corrupted by pacifism and decadence. That is the narrative that Nazi propaganda promoted, and that, surprisingly, many repeated after the war. But is it true? The reality is much more nuanced. The French army of 1940 was not weak in absolute terms. In fact, France possessed more tanks than Germany. Its artillery was formidable. Its infantry was trained, and in many cases, fought with extraordinary determination. The Maginot Line, although today remembered as a symbol of strategic rigidity, was in reality a masterpiece of defensive engineering that fulfilled its purpose. The German forces never breached it frontally. What failed was not the French army per se. What failed was the doctrine, the strategy, the capacity to adapt. The French commands were prepared to fight the last war, not the next one. Their planning assumed that the war would unfold at a pace similar to that of 1914-1918. Static fronts, advances measured in meters, wars of attrition decided by the accumulation of resources over months and years. But the Blitzkrieg shattered all those assumptions: the speed of the German advance, the coordination among tanks, infantry and aviation, the willingness to concentrate armoured forces at a breaking point and then exploit that gap with an aggressiveness that the French commands simply could not process in time. All of that created a fatal mismatch between what the French expected and what actually happened. And there is a factor that is often underestimated: communication. German forces used radio extensively to coordinate their movements in real time. French commands depended heavily on fixed telephone lines and messengers, communication systems that were much slower and became inoperative when the lines were cut by the rapid German advance. In a war where speed was the decisive factor, the inability to communicate rapidly was lethal. There is also the factor of Allied incoordination. Belgium and the Low Countries had maintained their neutrality, which limited joint planning with France and Great Britain. When Belgium finally allowed the entry of Allied troops, it was under the pressure of the already ongoing German attack, which means that the coordination was improvised, not planned. The Allied armies were fighting not as a unified force, but as a collection of national forces with different doctrines, different chains of command, and different priorities. All of this, the outdated doctrine, the deficient communication, the lack of Allied coordination, the strategic rigidity, combined with German operational brilliance to produce a result that astonished the world. But Nazi propaganda simplified all this into a much simpler narrative. Germany was superior. The others were inferior. The victory was natural, inevitable, an expression of the racial order that the Nazis preached. And that narrative, absorbed by millions of Germans, reinforced the belief that the next campaign, the one in the East, would also be a triumphal stroll. After all, if the French army, considered the most powerful in Europe, had fallen in 6 weeks, how long could the Red Army resist, having just been humiliated by tiny Finland in the Winter War of 1939-1940? That was the logic that took Germany to the East, and that logic was fundamentally wrong. Because the Soviet Union was not France. It was a country of continental dimensions, with a population of almost 200 million people, with virtually inexhaustible natural resources, with an industrial capacity that, although initially inferior to Germany's, could be mobilized on a scale that Germany could not match. And crucially, it was a country that was not going to surrender. The Soviet culture of resistance, forged in decades of revolution, civil war, and repression, produced a willingness to accept losses that would have been inconceivable in any Western society. The Soviet Union would lose more than 20 million people in the war, 20 million, and it would keep fighting. None of that figured into Hitler's calculations, or if it figured, it was dismissed, because the decision-making system of the Third Reich was designed to confirm Hitler's beliefs, not to question them. Generals who dissented were replaced. Intelligence analyses that contradicted expectations were ignored. Optimistic reports were amplified. Pessimistic reports were suppressed. The result was a closed loop of positive feedback in which the information that reached Hitler confirmed what Hitler wanted to hear, and Hitler's decisions were based on information that did not reflect reality. It is the same phenomenon that we observe at the level of propaganda directed at the public. At the leadership level, it functioned in an analogous manner. Hitler was not just deceiving his people. In a certain sense, he was also deceiving himself, or allowing himself to be deceived, which at that point was the same thing. Now we are going to stop at a specific moment of Operation Barbarossa that illustrates this dynamic with devastating clarity: the strategic controversy of August of 1941. By mid-July, German forces had advanced more than 640 kilometers into Soviet territory. Moscow was only 320 kilometers away. Army Group Center, which was the most powerful force of the three, had the momentum and capacity to launch a direct assault on the Soviet capital. The Army General Staff, the OKH, strongly recommended it. Moscow was not just the political capital of the Soviet Union, it was also a critical railway node, whose capture would have disorganized Soviet communications across the entire front. But Hitler rejected that plan. Instead of advancing towards Moscow, he ordered the Army Group Center divert a significant part of its armored forces to the south to support the conquest of Ukraine, and another part to the north to reinforce the siege of Leningrad. The decision was motivated by a combination of factors: the economic importance of Ukraine, with its wheat fields and industrial resources, the desire to secure the flanks before advancing further east, and probably Hitler's personal conviction that he knew more about strategy than his generals. The operational result was the spectacular encirclement of Kiev, with its 700,000 prisoners. In numerical terms, it was a colossal victory. In strategic terms, it was a mistake that consumed crucial weeks. By the time Hitler authorized the resumption of the advance toward Moscow in October, autumn had arrived. The rains had turned the roads into quagmires, and the Soviets had had time to reinforce their defences. And what did the German newsreels say? They celebrated Kiev as the greatest encirclement victory in history. The prisoner figures were shown as irrefutable proof of German superiority. What was not mentioned was the lost time, the missed opportunity, the fact that the window to take Moscow before winter had closed. And here we come to another of those moments that define the difference between the war that Hitler saw and the war that actually happened. In November of 1941, the German soldiers of Army Group Center could see the outskirts of Moscow. Some accounts speak of soldiers who could make out the domes of the Kremlin with their binoculars. They were so close, so incredibly close, and yet the city did not fall, because Moscow was not a defenseless city waiting to be taken. It was a fortress defended by 1 million soldiers, backed by reserves that kept arriving from the east of the country, and commanded by a general, Zhukov, who demonstrated a remarkable ability to anticipate his enemy's movements. The Soviets had built multiple defensive lines. They had placed anti-tank obstacles. They had mobilized the civilian population to dig trenches and fortifications. And the Germans, on the other side, were at the limit of their strength. The panzer divisions that had crossed the border on the 22nd of June, at full strength, were now reduced to a fraction of their capacity. The soldiers marched in summer uniforms, in temperatures that dropped below 30 degrees below zero. The weapons froze. The vehicles would not start. The supply lines were collapsed. In early December, the Soviets launched their counteroffensive. It was sudden. It was massive. And it was devastatingly effective. The Germans, who had been advancing for almost 6 months, suddenly found themselves retreating. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht was on the defensive. For the first time, the arrows on the maps pointed west instead of east. And what were the Germans told? They were told that it was a strategic withdrawal, that the positions were being consolidated, that the winter was the only obstacle, and that in the spring everything would return to normal. They were told that the Soviet Union was exhausted, that one last effort would suffice, that victory was within reach. But it wasn't. And deep down, many began to suspect it. Letters from the front, although censored, let slip hints. The faces of the soldiers who returned told a different story than the one appearing in the newspapers. And the implacable mathematics of the casualties, those 200,000 dead Germans in 6 months of Barbarossa, compared to the 30,000 of the entire campaign in France, was a figure that, even distorted by propaganda, began to filter an uncomfortable truth. The war that Hitler saw was not the war that occurred, and the war that Germany believed it was winning was not the war it was actually fighting. It was a construct, a mirage sustained by propaganda, censorship, and the inability of an authoritarian system to confront its own failures. That gap between perception and reality, between narrative and facts, between what is told and what happens, is perhaps the most relevant dimension of the events we have reviewed today. Because it forces us to ask, are we sure that we see the world as it is? Or do we see a filtered, edited version designed to make us believe what someone needs us to believe? Have you ever stopped to think about what a lie sounds like when it is repeated so many times that it stops sounding like a lie? How many repetitions does a falsehood need to become certainty within a mind that lacks the tools to question it? And what happens when that certainty, built with materials as fragile as the words of a propagandist, crumbles under the brutal weight of reality? That is the question we're going to explore in this second part. Because if in the first section we saw how Germany built its illusion of victory through 3 military campaigns, now we need to descend to the most intimate, most human, most painful level of that illusion. We need to see the war not from the maps of the High Command, nor from the newsreels of the Reich, but from the trenches, from the kitchens of German homes, from the letters that crossed thousands of kilometers between the front and home, loaded with hopes, half-truths, and increasingly silences that spoke louder than any word. But first, a reminder. Our goal is to reach 1 million subscribers. It seems like a lot, but with your help we can achieve it. Subscribe now, give it a like, and be part of this history. Well, let's return to the exact point where the illusion began to crack. And for that, we need to return to Smolensk. Smolensk, a city on the Dnieper River, about 400 kilometers west of Moscow, the traditional gateway to the Russian capital. Napoleon crossed it in 1812 on his way to a victory that would become his worst defeat. And now, in July of 1941, the Wehrmacht was heading towards it with the same blind confidence that had characterized the French emperor more than a century before. The battle was fought around the city of Smolensk between the 10th of July and the 10th of September of 1941, about 400 kilometers west of Moscow. By then, the Wehrmacht had already penetrated 500 kilometers into Soviet territory in barely 18 days since the start of the invasion on the 22nd of June. 500 kilometers in 18 days. The speed was astonishing. The German tanks advanced like an unstoppable wave, and the Red Army soldiers fell, surrendered, or simply became trapped in gigantic encirclements from which they could not escape. Between the 22nd of June and the 10th of July, the Wehrmacht advanced up to 500 kilometers into Soviet territory, killed or captured up to 1 million Red Army soldiers, and reached the western banks of the Western Dvina and Dnieper rivers. 1 million soldiers killed or captured in less than 3 weeks. The figures are so enormous that the mind struggles to process them. Every one of those numbers was a person. Every prisoner was a face, a family waiting in some Siberian or Ukrainian village, an interrupted life. With the Red Army now shattered, Hitler and most Germans expected a total victory in a matter of weeks. The newsreels of the Reich were filled with triumphal images, the columns of Soviet prisoners, endless, dusty, with emaciated faces, were exhibited as trophies of German military superiority. Maps showed arrows penetrating deeper and deeper into the vast Soviet territory, and each arrow was presented as irrefutable proof that final victory was at their fingertips. But what was really happening in Smolensk? The advance across the Soviet Union had come at a high cost in soldiers and material, and the Red Army remained prepared and willing to fight. The Battle of Smolensk and its high rate of attrition revealed that blitzkrieg tactics could not work in the long term in the vast spaces of the Soviet Union. That was the first crack, not in the narrative, which remained intact, not in the propaganda, which kept proclaiming victory after victory. The crack was in the military reality, in the attrition of the divisions, in the unsustainable extension of the supply lines, in the fierce and unexpected resistance of an enemy that refused to crumble according to the foreseen script. The Soviet 16th, 19th, and 20th armies were encircled and destroyed east of Smolensk, though many soldiers of the 19th and 20th armies managed to escape the pocket. Escape. That verb, so small, hid a truth that the German High Command did not want to confront. The Soviets did not behave like Western armies. When surrounded, they did not surrender en masse. Many fought to the death. Others found gaps in the encirclements and slipped through them, taking with them the will to keep fighting. And those who were captured were replaced by new waves of troops that seemed to surge from nowhere, from the limitless interior of a country that stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific. The subsequent battles in the Smolensk region frustrated German hopes of a quick victory. Once across the Dvina and Dnieper rivers, a surprised Wehrmacht encountered 5 fresh Soviet armies. Despite entirely destroying 2 of these armies, severely damaging 2 others, and encircling the remnants of 3 of these armies in the Smolensk region, the quick victory eluded the Germans. And what was said in Germany about all this? What was always said? Victory, advance, destruction of the enemy. Wehrmacht reports announced astronomical figures of prisoners and captured equipment. But what they did not mention was that every kilometre conquered represented one more kilometre of supply line to protect. What they did not mention was that the tanks needed maintenance, that the trucks consumed fuel at a rate that German factories could barely sustain, that the soldiers had been marching for weeks without proper rest. Although the battle was an impressive operational success for the Germans, the rapid advances in Soviet territory led to logistical and supply crises of increasing severity. After the encirclement of Smolensk, a large part of Army Group Center became bogged down in a war of position, suffering significant losses in defensive battles throughout the late summer of 1941. These factors seriously depleted the offensive strength of the German divisions and contributed to the disastrous setbacks subsequently suffered in the Battle of Moscow in December of 1941. Do you see it? There is the history that the propaganda hid. The Battle of Smolensk was not just a German victory. It was also the moment when the Blitzkrieg began to fail. It was the point where the lightning war strategy crashed against the reality of an immense country, of a regenerating army, of a climate that was beginning to change. It was the first sign, invisible to the eyes of the German public, but perfectly clear to the eyes of the generals, studying the maps in the headquarters of the High Command, that the war in the East was not going to be what Hitler had promised. And now let's stop at something that doesn't usually appear in documentaries, something that connects us directly with the lived experience of the people who went through these events, the letters of the German soldiers to their families. When the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, they found a propagandistic goldmine. Conditions in the Soviet Union were often deplorable by German standards. In January of 1942, the Nazis published a 60-page booklet entitled German Soldiers See the Soviet Union, Letters from the Field from the East. It consisted mostly of extracts from soldiers' letters, reporting on the conditions they found. The letters, of course, were carefully selected. That is, even the private letters of the soldiers were instrumentalized by the propagandistic machinery. Goebbels and his ministry chose those that reinforced the narrative. The Soviet Union is a miserable place. Communism is a failure. The Germans are bringing civilization to the East. The soldiers had credibility, and the booklet surely made an impact. The Germans who read it, even if they doubted Adolf Hitler, probably concluded that National Socialism was undoubtedly preferable to Bolshevism. That was the mechanics of propaganda in its most refined form. It was not just about lying, it was about selecting partial truths that, taken out of context, supported the desired conclusion. The soldiers saw poverty in the Soviet Union and wrote about it. That was real. But the conclusion that the regime drew from those observations, that Germany was superior, that the invasion was just, that the destiny of the East was to be colonized by the West, was a monstrous distortion. Karl Fuchs was a German soldier in the Second World War who fought and died on the Eastern Front. He loved studying, music, and sports. He was also a prolific writer of letters and postcards. His letters from 1937 to 1941 provide a unique perspective of this important period, from the point of view of a typical young German, caught up in the fascination of Adolf Hitler and the new Germany. A typical young man, not a fanatic, not a war criminal, a young man who loved music and sports, who wrote letters to his wife and his father, who wanted to meet his newborn daughter. The departure from the military base, where they had been stationed for so long, was quite a ceremony, very emotional. They left there with their tanks decorated with flowers. The townspeople had given them many small gifts and were very kind. Tanks decorated with flowers. That image says more about the mood of Germany in the summer of 1941 than any political analysis. The war was a party, a celebration, a parade. But Karl Fuchs's letters also show something else. He wrote that he was convinced that the last cohesive forces of the enemy had been decimated, and that once again his Führer had proven to the world that the German soldier could perform incredible tasks. The propaganda was not just in the newspapers and on the radio. It was inside the minds of the soldiers themselves. They also believed. They also saw events through the filter that the regime had built during years of indoctrination. Karl Fuchs was killed on the battlefield on the 21st of November of 1941 during an intense combat with Russian tanks. They prepared a dignified resting place for him near the city of Klin, north of Moscow. Klin, north of Moscow, so close to the Soviet capital, and yet so far from the victory that the propaganda kept promising. Karl Fuchs never met his daughter. He never returned home. He never knew that the war he had been told he was winning was about to become the greatest military catastrophe in the history of Germany. And his wife, and his family, what did they know? They received an official letter saying that her husband fell fighting bravely for Greater Germany. Words designed to comfort, words that converted death into sacrifice, suffering into purpose, loss into contribution. Propaganda did not end in the newsreels. It continued even in the condolence letters. Now let's broaden the perspective. Because Karl Fuchs was not an isolated case, he was one among millions. And the collective experience of those millions of soldiers and their families formed the fabric upon which the illusion of victory was sustained, and upon which it eventually crumbled. Many German and Axis soldiers began the campaign with optimism, believing Hitler's assertion that the Red Army of the Soviet Union was rotten and would soon crumble. A German soldier, Bernhard Bechler, reassured his sister as he departed for the Eastern Front, saying, "Listen, now we will separate. In a few weeks I will call you from Moscow." I was completely convinced that this would happen, and in fact I was proud of our plans. In a few weeks I will call you from Moscow. That phrase crystallizes the absolute confidence that the propaganda had generated. It was not hope, it was certainty. The same certainty that was felt in the streets of Berlin, in the factories of Hamburg, on the farms of Bavaria. Germany was going to win. Fast, uncomplicated, like in Poland, like in France. But the Soviet Union was neither Poland nor France, and the soldiers who arrived there with flowers on their tanks would soon discover a reality that no one had prepared them to face. Axis soldiers suffered melancholy due to the immense scale of the Soviet Union. For those responsible for logistics, the vast distances involved and the lack of good roads turned out to be a nightmare. The spaces seemed infinite, the horizon foggy. They were depressed by the monotony of the landscape and the immensity of the extensive forests, swamps, and plains. The spaces seemed infinite. That phrase from General Hasso von Manteuffel captures something essential. The Soviet Union was not a country, it was a continent. And the Blitzkrieg, designed for compact and well-communicated Western European spaces, was not prepared for those dimensions. The spring and autumn rains turned the roads into quagmires. As Major Hans Heinrichs, a German army engineer, explained, it was completely different from France and, of course, from the desert area. France had a very dense road network, only a few forests. In Russia, we had very few roads, and these became quite muddy already in September. Few roads, quagmires in September, endless forests, rivers without bridges, logistics. That invisible aspect of war that propaganda never mentioned was devouring the operational capacity of the Wehrmacht. Every advancing tank needed fuel, ammunition, spare parts. Every soldier needed food, water, clothing, and all that had to be transported across hundreds of kilometers of roads that did not even deserve the name. And here we arrive at a crucial point, a point that the official narrative of the Reich hid with special zeal. The war was not only being fought on the battlefields, it was also being fought behind the lines. And what was happening behind the lines was something nobody wanted to see. Shortly after the invasion, mobile extermination units began the mass murder of Soviet Jews. German military and civil occupation policies led to the deaths of millions of Soviet prisoners of war and Soviet civilians. In accordance with prior agreements between representatives of the SS, the police, and the Wehrmacht, German mobile units of the security police and SD officials called Einsatzgruppen, followed the frontline troops into the Soviet Union. The head of the RSHA, Heydrich, had tasked the commanders of the Einsatzgruppen to identify, concentrate, and murder Jews, Soviet officials, and other persons considered potentially hostile to German rule in the East. The squads of the Einsatzgruppen began carrying out mass shootings during the last week of June of 1941. There it is, the darkest dimension of Operation Barbarossa, the one that propaganda never revealed to the German people. It was not just a war of territorial conquest. It was not just a military campaign. It was a war of annihilation. And behind every front line that advanced victoriously, the Einsatzgruppen advanced as well, executing Jewish civilians, political commissars, anyone who was categorized as an enemy of the new order. Following the German invasion of the Soviet Union, Nazi propaganda emphasized to both civilians on the home front and soldiers, police, and non-German auxiliaries in the occupied territories themes that linked Soviet communism with European Judaism, presenting Germany as the defender of Western culture against the Judeo-Bolshevik threat. Do you see? The propaganda not only hid the atrocities, it created an ideological framework that justified them. If communism and Judaism were the same thing, and if both represented an existential threat to Western civilization, then fighting them, eradicating them, eliminating them was not a crime, but a necessity. That was the perverse logic that allowed common soldiers, people who in normal circumstances would never have murdered a civilian, to participate in acts of mass violence without feeling they were committing a crime. The vast majority of German soldiers saw the war in Nazi terms, considering the Soviet enemy as subhuman. Hitler referred to the war in radical terms, calling it a war of annihilation that was both ideological and racial. And did the soldiers know? Did they know what was happening behind their backs? Some did. Some participated directly. Others witnessed it without intervening. And many simply did not want to know, because knowing would have destroyed the narrative upon which their will to keep fighting was sustained. It is easier to believe that one is fighting for a just cause when one does not look at what is happening in the rearguard. Sometimes the soldiers on the Eastern Front could not even record in their diaries or letters what they had experienced. The silences in the letters were as eloquent as the words. A soldier who stopped describing what he saw had not run out of topics. It was that what he saw was indescribable, or unpronounceable, or both. And now let's think about the home front, in Germany, in the women who waited for letters, in the parents who listened to the radio, in the children who went to school and received lessons about the greatness of the Aryan race and the evil of the enemy. Goebbels promoted the Nazi message through art, music, theatre, films, books, radio, and the press, and censored all opposition. Goebbels worked to inflame the anger of Germans over their defeat in the First World War, and emphasised German cultural and military achievements to boost national pride. The system was total. There was not a single aspect of daily German life that was not permeated by propaganda. The music that was heard, the movies that were seen, the books that were read, the newspapers, the radio, the magazines, the posters on the streets, the speeches in the factories, the lessons in the schools. Everything was oriented in the same direction. Germany is great. Germany is just. Germany is winning. The main medium was Die Deutsche Wochenschau, a series of newsreels produced for cinemas since 1940. The newsreels were explicitly intended to portray German interests as successful. Themes frequently included the virtues of the Nordic or Aryan type, German military and industrial strength, and the evil of Germany's enemies. Die Deutsche Wochenschau, the weekly newsreel that was screened before every film in German cinemas. It was mandatory. It could not be skipped. And what it showed was a carefully edited version of the war, tanks advancing, flags waving, smiling soldiers, surrendered prisoners, conquered cities. Our own suffering was never shown, never the wounded soldiers, never the faces of the dead. The war on the cinema screen was a glorious, clean, almost sporting adventure. Signal was a propaganda magazine published by the Wehrmacht during the Second World War and distributed throughout occupied Europe and neutral countries. Published from April of 1940 to March of 1945, Signal achieved the highest sales of any magazine published in Europe during that period, with a circulation that reached 2,500,000 copies in 1943. At different times, it was published in at least 20 languages. 2,500,000 copies, 20 languages. Propaganda was not just a domestic affair, it was a continental enterprise. The magazine Signal carried the image of a powerful, modern, victorious Germany to all corners of Europe. The image that Signal transmitted was that of Nazi Germany and its new order as the great benefactor of the European peoples and of Western civilization in general. Germany as a benefactor, as a protector, as a civilizer. The inversion of reality was total. And now let's return to the front. Because while propaganda painted pictures of victory in cinemas and magazines, the reality in the East was deteriorating at a speed that no newsreel could hide indefinitely. Do you remember the controversy of August of 1941? That decision by Hitler to divert forces from the advance towards Moscow to conquer Kiev and Ukraine. I explored it briefly in the first part, but now we need to dig deeper, because that moment was possibly the most important turning point of the entire Operation Barbarossa, and perhaps of the whole war. Hitler believed that Moscow was of little importance for the defeat of the Soviet Union, and instead believed that victory would come with the destruction of the Red Army west of the capital. This belief subsequently led to disputes between Hitler and several high-ranking German officers, including Heinz Guderian, Gerhard Engel, Fedor von Bock, and Franz Halder, who believed that the decisive victory could only be obtained in Moscow. They were unable to convince Hitler, who had become excessively confident in his own military judgment as a result of the rapid successes in Western Europe. There is the key, excessively confident in his own military judgment as a result of the rapid successes in Western Europe. The triumphs in Poland and France did not just convince the German people that the war was going well, they convinced Hitler himself that he was a military genius. And when an authoritarian leader believes in his own infallibility, when the system that surrounds him is designed to confirm his beliefs instead of questioning them, the consequences can be catastrophic. Guderian, one of the Wehrmacht's most brilliant tank commanders, argued passionately in favour of continuing the direct advance towards Moscow. Moscow was not just the political capital, it was the most important railway node of the entire Soviet Union. Its capture would have disorganised Soviet communications from north to south, dividing the country into two disconnected halves. Halder, the chief of the Army General Staff, shared that opinion. Von Bock, commander of Army Group Centre as well. But Hitler ignored them all. He ordered the diversion of the 2nd and 3rd Panzer Groups, the spearhead of the advance on Moscow, towards the north to reinforce the siege of Leningrad, and towards the south to support the conquest of Kiev. The operational result was impressive. The Kiev encirclement trapped 4 complete Soviet armies and produced nearly 700,000 prisoners. It was the greatest encirclement in military history. The propaganda celebrated it as an unprecedented victory, and in numerical terms it was. But in strategic terms, it was a disaster. Because the weeks that the panzers spent diverted to the south and north were weeks they did not spend advancing towards Moscow, and those weeks were irreplaceable. Summer was ending. The autumn rains were about to turn the Russian roads into impassable quagmires, and behind those rains would come the winter. Pained by the countless wounds inflicted on his precious Wehrmacht, even before the fighting in the Smolensk region had ended, Hitler postponed his march on Moscow and instead directed his forces south to face easier targets in the Kiev region. The derailment of the Wehrmacht at Smolensk ultimately became the crucial turning point of Operation Barbarossa. The derailment. That word says it all. The German war machine was not stopped by the enemy. It was derailed by the decisions of its own leader. And the propaganda, That tool that had so effectively constructed the illusion of victory kept functioning, presenting every detour as a triumph, every delay as a brilliant strategic decision, every problem as a mere temporary difficulty. And the foreign press, what did the media outside Germany say? This is where the informational bubble of the Reich showed its true function. After Hitler's rise to power in 1933, all regular press came under complete Nazi editorial control through the policy of Gleichschaltung. Gleichschaltung, literally, coordination or synchronization. The process by which every institution, every organization, every media outlet within Germany was aligned with the ideology and goals of the Nazi Party. There was no room left for dissent. There was no room left for doubt. There was no room left for truth that did not coincide with the official version. And listening to foreign radio stations was a serious crime. A German citizen caught tuning in to the BBC or Radio Moscow could face prison sentences or even death. The informational isolation was complete, hermetic, designed not only to prevent truth from entering, but to create an alternative reality so consistent and so omnipresent that questioning it would be unthinkable. But did cracks appear? Were there fissures in that wall of propaganda? Yes. And they came from the most difficult source to censor, the soldiers themselves. When a young man returned from the front with wounds, with a vacant stare, with evasive answers to his family's questions, the newsreels could say whatever they wanted. The wounded body spoke a different language. When letters from the front, despite censorship, let slip phrases like, "I cannot describe what we have seen," or "everything is very different from what they told us," families began to intuit that something did not add up. Soon, the autumn mud was replaced by frosts and deep snows. Among the soldiers of the Wehrmacht, the number of frostbite cases increased drastically, and some soldiers froze to death, while others, unable to endure it, resorted to shooting themselves. This was the result of the risky plans of the Hitlerian leadership, which did not bother to provide its troops with winter uniforms, expecting to finish with the Soviet Union in just a couple of summer months. Soldiers shooting themselves, not out of cowardice, out of desperation, out of the impossibility of enduring a cold for which no one had prepared them, because the assumption upon which the entire operation was built, that the Soviet Union would fall before winter, turned out to be a fantasy. And when that fantasy evaporated, what remained were soldiers in summer uniforms, facing temperatures of 30 degrees below zero. In a letter to his wife dated the 16th of December, General Heinrichi admitted, "In the entire First World War, I was never in a situation like the one we are experiencing now. What the outcome will be, everything is in the hands of the Lord." The general began to turn more frequently to God and hope for a miracle, remembering the unenviable fate of Napoleon's army. A German general comparing his situation with that of Napoleon in Russia. A general turning to God because human strategy had failed. That is not what was heard on the newsreels of the Reich. That is not what German families read in the morning papers. What they read was that German forces were consolidating positions and that the final victory was near. But now we need to go beyond the battle itself and explore something that propaganda not only hid, but actively contradicted: the treatment of Soviet prisoners of war. German forces captured millions of Soviet prisoners of war who were not granted the protections stipulated in the Geneva Conventions. A majority never returned alive. Germany deliberately let the prisoners starve to death as part of a plan designed to reduce the population of Eastern Europe and then repopulate it with ethnic Germans. Millions of prisoners deliberately left to die. It was not a side effect of the war. It was a policy, a plan, a conscious and documented decision. And while those prisoners died in camps that lacked the bare minimum necessary for survival, German propaganda showed images of Soviet prisoners supposedly well treated, grateful to have been liberated from communism. And in German schools, what were the children learning? After the Germans initiated the Second World War, with the invasion of Poland in September of 1939. The Nazi regime employed propaganda to convince German civilians and soldiers that Jews were not only subhuman, but also dangerous enemies of the German Reich. German children learned that their fathers were fighting against an enemy that deserved no compassion. They learned that the war was just, necessary, inevitable. They learned that Germany was the victim, not the aggressor. And those children, upon growing up, would become the generation that would inherit the consequences of those lies. Only now, late in their lives, is a whole generation of post-war Germans able to face its contents, and by no means is it alone. This book provides a rare look at the so-called children of the war, an entire generation of post-war Germans who grew up repudiating their past, but who today must finally face the painful legacy of their parents' complicity in National Socialism. That phrase, the painful legacy of their parents' complicity, summarizes a tragedy that extended far beyond 1945. The illusion of victory not only destroyed cities and lives during the war, it destroyed the relationship of an entire generation with its own history, with its own parents, with the very idea of trusting what the authorities told them. Isn't that ultimately the deepest cost of propaganda? Not the lies themselves, but the destruction of the capacity to trust, when you discover that everything they told you was fabricated, manipulated, distorted. How do you ever believe in anything again? But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We are still in 1941, and the story still holds many layers to be discovered. Let's go back to October. Operation Typhoon. The last attempt to reach Moscow before winter made it impossible. After weeks of discussions about strategic direction, after diverting forces to the south and north, Hitler finally authorized the resumption of the advance towards Moscow. Army Group Center, the strongest of the three groups, had captured Smolensk in late July of 1941, before initiating an advance on Moscow on the 2nd of October. The 2nd of October, more than 3 months after the start of Barbarossa. 3 months that had been invested in spectacular encirclements, in massive captures of prisoners, in impressive territorial conquests, but that had not been invested in the objective that, according to most of the generals, was the decisive one, Moscow. And by then, the conditions had changed radically, facing logistical problems with supply, slowed by the muddy terrain, without being fully equipped for the brutal Russian winter, and dealing with resolute Soviet resistance, the offensive of Army Group Center came to a halt on the outskirts of the city by the 5th of December. The 5th of December, 2 months after the start of Operation Typhoon. The Germans were at the gates of Moscow. German casualties mounted as they agonizingly approached the capture of Moscow. Just 20 miles from their objective, the Soviets launched a sudden counterattack that forced the Germans onto the defensive. 20 miles, about 32 kilometers, the distance that separates the center of a large city from its furthest suburbs. They could see the towers of the Kremlin. They could imagine the Soviet surrender. They could taste the victory that propaganda had promised them since June. But victory did not arrive, and what arrived in its place changed the course of the war forever. At the beginning of that month, approximately 1 million Soviet soldiers launched a sudden counter-offensive to expel the German army from the vicinity of Moscow. 1 million Soviet soldiers. Where did they come from? German propaganda had assured for months that the Red Army was destroyed, that its reserves were exhausted, that the Soviet Union had no forces with which to counterattack. And yet, there they were, 1 million fresh soldiers, well equipped for the winter, well commanded, throwing themselves against an exhausted, frozen, and undersupplied Wehrmacht. The answer to the question of where they came from has a name: Siberian divisions. When Soviet intelligence confirmed, through spies like Richard Sorge in Tokyo, that Japan would not attack the Soviet Union from the east, Stalin was able to transfer complete divisions from Siberia and the Far East to the Western Front. These troops were acclimatized to extreme cold. Their weapons worked at below zero temperatures. Their uniforms were designed for the winter, and their arrival at the Moscow front was the factor that tipped the balance. Recently created Soviet units near Moscow now totaled more than 500,000 troops, and on the 5th of December launched a massive counter-offensive as part of the Battle of Moscow that pushed the Germans more than 320 kilometers to the west. By late December of 1941, the Germans had lost the Battle of Moscow, and the invasion had cost the German army more than 830,000 casualties, including dead, wounded, captured, or missing in action. 830,000 casualties in 6 months. Compare that with the figures of the Western Campaign of 1940, approximately 163,000 total casualties for the entire conquest of France, Belgium, and the Low Countries. In Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht was losing soldiers at a rate 5 times higher, and without the decisive victory that was supposed to justify those losses. The failure of Operation Barbarossa reversed the fortunes of Nazi Germany. That phrase, so brief, encloses a universe of suffering. Reverse the fortunes, which means the trajectory that until that moment had only known one direction, that of ascent, that of expansion, that of conquest, changed direction. Germany did not know it yet. Most Germans did not know it. But since December of 1941, the clock of the war was ticking against the Reich. The failure of Operation Barbarossa was a turning point in the fortunes of the Third Reich. Most importantly, the operation opened up the Eastern Front, to which more forces were committed than in any other theatre of war in world history. The Eastern Front became the site of some of the largest battles, most horrific atrocities, and highest casualties for Soviet and German units alike, all of which influenced the course of both World War II and the subsequent history of the 20th century. And now we arrive at the most uncomfortable question of all, the question that this video set out to answer from the beginning. How did Germany believe it was winning? It believed because it was told it was winning. It believed because every available source of information confirmed that version. It believed because the alternative, doubting the Führer, questioning the narrative, admitting that the sacrifices might be in vain, was psychologically unbearable and politically dangerous. But the illusion was also sustained on something more subtle. It was sustained on the very structure of the information. Think about this. When propaganda tells you that you captured 700,000 prisoners in Kiev, that is a verifiable, real, impressive fact. What the propaganda does not tell you is that while capturing those prisoners, you lost 6 weeks you needed to reach Moscow before winter. What it does not tell you is that every captured prisoner was a soldier who was going to be replaced by another. What it does not tell you is that your own casualties are accumulating at an unsustainable rate. What it does not tell you is that the enemy, far from collapsing, is reorganizing, reinforcing, hardening. Nazi propaganda did not always lie. Sometimes it simply selected the truths that suited it best and omitted those that contradicted it. And that form of disinformation is, in many ways, more dangerous than an outright lie, because a lie can be refuted with a fact, but a partial truth presented as a complete truth is much harder to dismantle. And was there a moment when the propaganda of the Reich prematurely declared victory over the Soviet Union? Yes. In October of 1941, Nazi propaganda published an article titled, "The Campaign in the East is Over." With premature proclamations of victory over the Soviet Union, the campaign in the East is over. October of 1941, 2 months before the Germans were pushed 320 kilometers to the west in the Soviet counter-offensive of Moscow. The distance between that proclamation and reality measures the exact magnitude of the illusion. And did Goebbels know? Did he know he was lying? Evidence suggests that Goebbels was more aware of reality than Hitler himself, but his function was not to evaluate reality, but to mold perception. Goebbels wrote in his diary that the essence of propaganda consists in winning people over to an idea so sincerely, so vitally, that in the end they succumb to it completely and can never escape from it. That phrase reveals a mind that conceives communication not as an instrument of information, but as an instrument of submission. It is not about informing, it is about capturing, about creating a mental prism from which the citizen cannot escape. And that prism worked for years. It worked during the invasion of Poland. It worked during the conquest of France. It worked during the early months of Barbarossa. It kept working even when the cracks began to multiply. After the Nazi defeat at Stalingrad in February of 1943, Goebbels admitted the recent losses and argued for total war in his famous Sportpalast speech. Even when reality became impossible to completely hide, propaganda found a way to reframe it. Defeat was not defeat. It was the preamble to a more intense, more committed, more total struggle. The narrative adapted like a virus, mutating before every obstacle to continue infecting the collective mind. But there came a point when not even the most sophisticated propaganda could maintain the illusion. Goebbels acknowledged that enemy propaganda is beginning to have an uncomfortably noticeable effect on the German people. Anglo-American leaflets are no longer carelessly discarded, but are read with attention. British broadcasts boast an appreciative audience. Allied leaflets were read with attention. British broadcasts were listened to with gratitude. The wall of propaganda that the regime had built over more than a decade was beginning to crumble. And when propaganda fails, when the official version is no longer credible, what remains is the void, a void of trust, of certainty, of direction. And in that void, fear expands like a gas that fills every corner. Now let's step back once more and look at the invasion of Poland, the conquest of France, and Operation Barbarossa as a complete narrative arc. Because when viewed together, these three campaigns are not just separate military events. They are the three acts of a tragedy in which trust was the most powerful weapon, and at the same time, the most lethal vulnerability. First act, Poland. Confidence is born, a rapid, devastating campaign, seemingly confirming the invincibilities of the Wehrmacht. Propaganda creates the narrative of legitimate defense. The people believe. Second act, France. Confidence is consolidated, the defeat of the most feared military power in Europe in 6 weeks. Propaganda proclaims German racial and strategic superiority. The people not only believe, they are euphoric. Third act, Barbarossa. Confidence becomes arrogance. The largest invasion in history is launched under the assumption that the enemy will collapse in weeks. Propaganda proclaims victory before it is achieved. And when reality proves that the assumption was wrong, the propagandistic machinery faces a dilemma it cannot resolve: how to maintain the illusion of a victory that drifts further away every day. And the answer the regime found was, perhaps, the most revealing of all: intensify the propaganda. Turn up the volume, repeat the message more frequently, add layers of ideology to give meaning to the suffering. If the war is not won quickly, it is because the enemy is more dangerous than fought, which means winning is even more important. If casualties are high, it is because sacrifice is necessary to protect Western civilization against the Judeo-Bolshevik threat. If winter halts the advance, it is a temporary setback that will be resolved in spring. Every setback was reinterpreted within a framework that turned it into one more reason to keep fighting. Never, ever, into a reason to question the decision to fight in the first place. Does it sound familiar? Do you recognize that logic? Because it did not die in 1945. That logic, the logic of reinterpreting every failure as justification for doubling down, lives on in many forms, in many contexts, in many corners of today's world. The tool has changed. It is no longer the shortwave radio or the cinema newsreel, but the phone screen. But the mechanism is identical. Control the narrative, select the convenient truths, omit the inconvenient ones, and create an alternative reality so consistent that questioning it seems like an act of treason. And what can we learn from all this? That truth does not defend itself, that it needs institutions to protect it: free press, independent courts, critical education, public debate. That when those institutions are weakened or eliminated, truth becomes just another casualty of war, often the first casualty, and that the responsibility to seek the truth is not solely that of the institutions. It belongs to every person, to every one of us, to every viewer who is right now watching this video and asking themselves if what they are being told from any source reflects reality or a self-serving version of it. That question, that discomfort, that willingness to doubt before believing is perhaps the most effective antidote against propaganda. Not the paranoid distrust that rejects everything, not the cynicism that concludes that all information is equally false, but the critical thinking that examines, compares, verifies, and reserves the right to change its mind when the evidence demands it. The Germans of 1939 did not have that right. It was taken from them by a regime that controlled all sources of information. We do possess it. And the most important lesson of this history is precisely not to take it for granted. Now, before closing, I want to take you to a final moment. A moment that for me encapsulates everything we have explored. A moment that does not appear in history books, because it is not a military event, nor a strategic decision, nor a statistical fact. It is a human instant, tiny, almost invisible amid the roar of great events. It is November of 1941, near the city of Klin, north of Moscow. A German tank crewman named Karl Fuchs writes his last letter. He does not know it is his last. Nobody ever knows when they write their last letter. He writes about the conviction that the enemy is defeated. He writes about his Führer with devotion. He writes probably about his daughter, whom he never met. Days later, a Soviet projectile finds his tank, and Karl Fuchs, the young man who loved music, sports, and letters, ceases to exist. His body is buried in Russian soil, far from everything he knew, and his wife receives a piece of paper that says her husband died, fighting bravely for Greater Germany. But Karl Fuchs did not die for Greater Germany. He died for an illusion, for a lie he was told was truth, for a narrative constructed with such care, with such precision, with such effort, that he never had the tools to question it. And that is the price of propaganda, not the casualty figures, which are abstract and enormous and difficult to comprehend, not the maps with arrows, which are impersonal and cold, but this, a young man who never met his daughter because he believed in the wrong words. Now let's think about the scale. Multiply Karl Fuchs by 200,000, which is the approximate number of Germans who died just during Operation Barbarossa. 200,000 families who received letters with the same phrase, fell fighting bravely. 200,000 bodies in foreign soil. 200,000 empty spaces at German kitchen tables. And on the other side, the Soviet side, the scale is even more overwhelming. Of the estimated 70 to 85 million deaths attributed to the war, around 30 million occurred on the Eastern Front, including 9 million children. 30 million people, 9 million children. Those figures are so large they cease to mean anything. They become statistics. But every one of those 30 million was a person with a name, with a family, with dreams, with a life that was cut short by a war they did not ask for and did not provoke. The Eastern Front was decisive in determining the outcome of the European theatre of operations in the Second World War and constitutes the main cause of the defeat of Nazi Germany and the Axis nations. Historian Geoffrey Roberts noted that more than 80% of all combat during the Second World War took place on the Eastern Front. More than 80% of all combat. The Eastern Front was not a secondary aspect of the war. It was the war. What happened in Normandy, in North Africa, in Italy, in the Pacific, was important, but it represented a fraction of the total war effort. The Second World War was decided, fundamentally, in the steppes and forests of the Soviet Union. And it was there that the illusion of German victory crashed against a reality that no propaganda could alter. And what does all this tell us about the future? It tells us that information is the first line of defense of any society, that when the ability to access diverse, verifiable, and contradictory information is lost, the capacity to make informed decisions is lost, and that uninformed decisions, whether by a leader or a people, lead to catastrophes. It also tells us that trust is a resource that must be earned with transparency and maintained with consistency. A regime that needs to lie to sustain itself is building on sand, and when the tide rises, and the tide always rises, everything built on sand crumbles. And it tells us finally that memory matters, that remembering what happened is not an academic exercise, but an ethical obligation. Because if we forget how a society was manipulated to believe in a lie, if we forget the price paid for that manipulation, we are opening the door for it to happen again, with different tools perhaps, with different names surely, but with the same fundamental mechanics. Control what people know to control what people believe, and control what people believe to control what people do. Let's return now to the military plane to close the arc of the 3 key events we have analysed. The invasion of Poland lasted just over a month. The conquest of France lasted 6 weeks. Operation Barbarossa, which was planned to last between 8 and 10 weeks, dragged on for 4 years. 4 years of the most intense, most brutal, most destructive combat humanity had ever witnessed. And the reason it dragged on so long was, precisely, that the assumptions upon which it was designed turned out to be false. Every single one of them. Assumption 1, the Soviet Union is militarily weak, false. The Red Army was initially surprised and suffered catastrophic losses, but its ability to regenerate, to mobilize new forces, to learn from its mistakes, and to resist under extreme conditions surpassed every German expectation. Assumption 2, the war will be short. False. Blitzkrieg, designed for rapid conflicts in compact spaces, did not work in the continental dimensions of the Soviet Union. The distances were too great, the roads too bad, the climate too severe, and the enemy too resilient. Assumption 3, the capture of key cities, will produce the collapse of the Soviet regime. False. The Soviets lost Kiev, Smolensk, Minsk, Kharkov, and dozens of other important cities. They lost territories where tens of millions of people lived. They lost crucial industrial infrastructure, and they kept fighting, because the Soviet Union was not a house of cards that collapsed when a piece was removed. It was an immense organism, with a territorial depth that allowed it to absorb blows that would have destroyed any other country. Assumption 4, the German people will support the war indefinitely if kept informed of victories. Partially true, but unsustainable in the long term. As long as the victories were real and rapid, the support was genuine. But when the victories stopped being rapid, when the casualties began to accumulate, when the soldiers stopped returning, the propaganda needed to exert itself more and more to maintain the illusion. And eventually, not even the most intense effort was enough. Each of those assumptions was the product of the same dynamic, a closed decision-making system in which information that did not match the leader's expectations was filtered, minimized, or discarded. Hitler did not want to hear that the Soviet Union was strong. He did not want to hear that the war would be long. He did not want to hear that the Blitzkrieg would not work in the East. And since no one dared to tell him what he did not want to hear, decisions were made based on an imagined reality, not the actual reality. It is the same dynamic that operated at the level of propaganda directed at the public. At the leadership level, it functioned identically, but with even more direct consequences. When a citizen believes a lie, they vote the wrong way. When a leader believes a lie, they send armies to die. And that was exactly what happened, time and time again, from September of 1939 until May of 1945. Decisions based on distorted information, strategies based on false assumptions, military campaigns based on the conviction that will and ideology could substitute for logistics and numbers. They could not. And here is a devastating irony. Do you remember Hitler's quote about the Soviet Union? Hitler had fatally underestimated Soviet determination with his assertion, "You only have to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. You only have to kick in the door." Those words reveal the level of contempt, of arrogance, of willful blindness, with which Hitler approached the most important invasion of the war, and the structure did not come crashing down. The door held, and the one who ended up falling was the one who kicked it. Why are we telling all this? Why does it matter so many decades later? It matters because the tools change, but the mechanisms remain. It matters because understanding how a society was led to war through informational manipulation is not a history exercise. It is a survival exercise. It matters because every generation faces its own versions of this dynamic, its own fabricated narratives, its own leaders demanding blind trust, and its own decisions about whether to question or accept what they are told. The war that Hitler saw was not the war that occurred, and the victory that Germany believed it was achieving was not victory. It was the preamble to the greatest defeat in its history. And the distance between those two versions, the lived and the narrated, the real and the fabricated, is the exact measure of the damage that propaganda can cause. Think about that the next time you read a headline, the next time you watch a newsreel, the next time someone tells you what is happening in the world with absolute certainty and no room for doubt. Ask yourselves, am I seeing reality, or am I seeing an edited version of reality? Do I have the complete information, or only the part that someone wants me to see? Are the sources I consult diverse and independent, or do they all say the same thing because they all come from the same place? Those questions are not paranoia. They are informational hygiene. They are the intellectual equivalent of washing your hands before eating. They do not guarantee you will never be fooled, but they enormously reduce the probability. And in a world saturated with information, much of it designed to manipulate, that reduction can be the difference between lucidity and blindness. Now, let's return one last time to the battlefields for one final journey. I want you to imagine a sequence, not as an abstract account, but as a sensory experience. It is the 1st of September of 1939. Dawn over Poland. The roar of the bombers. The crunch of the tanks on the dirt roads. The smell of gunpowder and gasoline. A 19-year-old German soldier advances with his platoon toward the border. He wears a steel helmet, carries a Mauser rifle, and has the absolute conviction that his country was attacked first. The radio said so. The newspapers confirmed it. His sergeant repeated it. Everyone agrees. Germany is the victim, he is the defender. And when he fires his first bullet against a Polish position, he does so with the clear conscience of someone who believes he is acting in self-defense. But nobody attacked Germany. The Gleiwitz incident was a setup. The corpses in Polish uniforms were prisoners murdered by the SS. The provocation was invented from beginning to end, and that 19-year-old soldier, with his helmet and his rifle and his clear conscience, is participating in a war of aggression that he believes is defensive. Let's advance 9 months. It is June of 1940. The same soldier, now 20 years old, advances along the roads of France. The trees are green. The sun is shining. The German columns advance at a speed that amazes even their own commanders. The French army is crumbling. There are so many prisoners they don't know where to put them. And our soldier, who 9 months ago trembled when crossing the Polish border, now marches with a smile. The war is easy. Victory is certain. The Führer is a genius. Everything he was told is true. Let's advance another year. It is June of 1941. The same soldier, now 21 years old, crosses the Soviet border at 4:15 in the morning. The tank engines roar. The Luftwaffe dominates the skies. The columns of Soviet prisoners are endless. Everything looks like Poland and France. Everything confirms the narrative. The Soviet Union is going to fall. It is a matter of weeks. A few more weeks, and it will all be over. But the weeks pass, and the weeks turn into months, and the roads turn into quagmires, and the nights grow longer, and the temperatures drop, and drop, and drop, and the supplies do not arrive, and comrades fall, and the letters home become shorter, more brief, more full of silences. And one day, somewhere on the Moscow front, in December of 1941, that 21-year-old soldier, with numb fingers and a weapon jammed by ice, Here's a sound that was not in the script. The roar of Soviet tanks advancing, not retreating, advancing towards him. And in that moment, in that precise instant, the illusion breaks, not with a dramatic revelation, not with a radio announcement. It breaks with the sound of enemy engines approaching, with the sensation of the ground trembling beneath his feet, with the sudden, terrifying realization that everything he was told about this war was incomplete, distorted, or simply false. And then what? What is left when the illusion breaks? Reality is left, cold, hard, relentless. The belated knowledge of having been deceived is left. The question that nobody dared to ask while there was still time is left. What if they are lying to us? That question, asked in time, could have changed everything. Asked too late, it only serves to measure the magnitude of the catastrophe. And that is the lesson. Not for the Germans of 1941. For them, the lesson arrived too late, soaked in blood and ash. The lesson is for us, for whoever is listening to this now, for whoever lives in a world where information flows in unimaginable quantities, and where distinguishing the true from the fabricated is more difficult than ever, and at the same time, more important than ever. The war that Hitler saw was a mirage. The war that Germany believed in was a construct, and the price of that mirage, of that construct, was paid by millions of people who did not design the illusion, but who lived it to its ultimate consequences. Let us not forget it. And with that reflection, we reach the end of our journey. We have walked from the borders of Poland in September of 1939 to the outskirts of Moscow in December of 1941. We have seen how propaganda constructed a narrative of victory over a reality that was much more complex, much darker, and much more dangerous than what the German people were permitted to know. We have seen how confidence, fueled by real successes, but interpreted through an ideological filter, turned into arrogance, and how that arrogance led to decisions that sealed the fate of millions. If this story made you think, if it led you to question, if it reminded you of the importance of seeking the truth for yourself and not settling for the version others want you to accept, then this video fulfilled its purpose. Tell us in the comments, what was the moment of this history that impacted you the most? The false flag operation in Glavitz, the trap of the Ardennes, the frozen soldiers at the gates of Moscow? Or was it something more subtle, like the mechanism of propaganda, that invisible machinery that turned millions of people into involuntary accomplices of a fabricated narrative? And if you want us to dig deeper, if you want us to explore what came next, how Stalingrad became the definitive breaking point, how propaganda had to reinvent itself when defeats became impossible to hide, how an entire people had to face the truth that had been denied to them for years, say so. Leave your comment, share this video, subscribe if you haven't already done so. Remember, our goal is to reach 1 million subscribers. It seems like a lot, but with your help we can achieve it. Give it a like and be part of this history. Because this history is not just about the past, it is about how we understand the present, and about how we can build a future in which the truth is not just one more casualty. That was all. Until the next video.